gavel in hand, the judge prepared to finalize what everyone in that Bloemfontein courtroom already assumed was a formality. "Before you rule," said Elsabe van der Merwe, standing alone at the front of the room, "I want it on record that National Land Bank's claim contains an error that invalidates this entire seizure." The bank's lead attorney, a tall man named Willem Botha, barely glanced up from his files. "Noted," he said, already reaching for his papers, clearly ready to move on. Elsabe, 54 years old, third generation on her family's 1,600 hectares in the Free State, didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She knew something that room didn't, and within the hour, that same judge who'd barely looked up from his notes would fall completely silent. "Before we continue, tell me in the comments which country or region you're watching from tonight." Dust from the harvest still clung to Elsabe's boots when she'd left for court that morning, a detail she hadn't bothered to change before facing the bank's lawyers. Her father had built this farm from nothing after buying it in the early 1970s, maize in the summer rains, cattle grazing the far pastures, and enough good seasons that by the time Elsabe took over in her 30s, the operation supported not just her family, but 11 full-time workers and their households too. 3 years of severe drought changed everything. Yields dropped by nearly half 2 seasons running, and when National Land Bank offered to restructure her existing loan to ease the pressure, Elsabe signed without reading every clause as carefully as she should have. She trusted the bank representative who walked her through it, a soft-spoken man who kept repeating how much easier this would make things. It didn't. Within 18 months, National Land Bank claimed she'd fallen behind on a repayment schedule that seemed to shift every few months, always slightly different from what she remembered agreeing to. Calls to the bank's regional office went in circles. Letters requesting a copy of the original restructured agreement took months to arrive. And when they finally did, Elsabe noticed something odd. The interest calculation in the copy didn't match the numbers on her own bank statements from the same period. Neighbors told her not to bother fighting. "Nobody wins against the land bank," a fellow farmer named Petrus Coetzee warned her over coffee one morning. "Take whatever settlement they offer and start over somewhere smaller." Elsabe understood his logic. She'd watched 3 other farms in the district get swallowed by bank seizures over the past 2 years, each family too exhausted or too broke to challenge the paperwork. Something about those mismatched numbers bothered her enough to keep digging anyway. She spent months gathering every bank statement, every letter, every version of the loan agreement she could get her hands on, cross-referencing dates and figures late into the night after the day's farm work was done. By the time National Land Bank filed for seizure, Elsabe had a folder thick with inconsistencies she didn't yet fully understand, but she understood enough to know the bank's case wasn't as solid as they believed. Confidence radiated from National Land Bank's legal team as the court date approached, scheduling the property transfer paperwork weeks in advance, as though the ruling were already decided. Botha's office sent Elsabe a final letter, almost dismissive in tone, suggesting she accept the outcome gracefully rather than waste the court's time. If you've stayed with this story, you already sense something's about to shift. And if you want to see exactly how a quiet farmer took on a national bank, hit subscribe now, because we're about to get to the moment the judge goes completely silent. 2 weeks before the hearing, Elsabe finally brought her folder of documents to an attorney named Naledi Mokowena, a young lawyer who'd built a small but growing practice representing farmers in disputes with agricultural lenders. Naledi spent an entire weekend going through the inconsistencies Elsabe had gathered, cross-checking interest rate clauses against South African lending regulations. "Elsabe," Naledi said when she finally called back, her voice measured but unmistakably urgent, "the interest rate the bank used to calculate your default wasn't the rate in your original signed agreement. Someone changed a number, and it's the difference between you owing what you thought you owed and what they're now claiming, which conveniently pushed you into default status just in time for this seizure." Elsabe had suspected something was wrong. Hearing it confirmed, stated plainly by someone who understood the legal weight of it, still hit differently. "Can we prove it in court?" she asked. Naledi didn't answer right away. "I think," she finally said, "we're about to find out." Naledi rose slowly in the courtroom 2 weeks later, holding 2 documents side by side, the bank's certified copy of the restructured loan agreement and a set of Elsabe's original bank statements from the same period. "Your Honor, I'd like to draw the court's attention to a specific discrepancy," she said, placing both on the evidence table. "The interest rate National Land Bank used to calculate my client's alleged default is 11.2%. The rate recorded in her actual signed agreement, filed with the bank 3 years ago, is 9.8%. Botha shifted in his seat. Counsel is mistaken, he said quickly. These figures would have been reviewed extensively before. They weren't reviewed extensively, Naledi interrupted, calm but firm. In fact, my client requested a copy of this exact agreement 4 separate times over 18 months, and the version she eventually received doesn't match the numbers on her own bank statements issued by National Land Bank itself. Silence spread through the room as the judge leaned forward, studying both documents now laid before him. 9.8%, correctly calculated, meant El Sabe was never actually behind on her payments. The higher rate the bank had used, applied retroactively, had manufactured a default that never should have existed. Your Honor, Naledi continued, if this discrepancy is confirmed, National Land Bank's entire claim to accelerate this debt and seize my client's 1,600 hectares collapses. There is no valid default. There is only an error, or a deliberate miscalculation, in the bank's own paperwork. Botha opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Whatever argument he'd prepared clearly hadn't accounted for 2 matching documents laid directly in front of a judge who was now doing the arithmetic himself, longhand, on a legal pad. Minutes passed. Nobody in the gallery moved. The judge set down his pen, removed his glasses, and looked first at the documents, then at Botha. Then finally at El Sabe herself. He said nothing for nearly 30 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the impatience from earlier that morning. This court will not finalize any seizure based on figures that cannot be independently verified as accurate. I am ordering an immediate forensic audit of this loan's entire payment and interest history, conducted by an independent third party. Before any further action is taken, Botha said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Word of the ruling spread through the district within days. The forensic audit, completed 6 weeks later, confirmed exactly what Naledi had argued. National Land Bank's regional office had applied an incorrect interest rate to El Sabe's account, manufacturing a default that legally never existed. The seizure case was dismissed entirely, and El Sabe's loan was corrected to reflect the accurate balance she'd owed all along. That wasn't where the story ended, though. The audit's findings triggered a wider review of National Land Bank's restructuring practices across the province, after Naledi's office flagged similar rate discrepancies in 4 other farmers' accounts. Families who, like El Sabe, had trusted the bank's paperwork without realizing the numbers had shifted beneath them. Petrus Coetzi, the neighbor who'd once warned her nobody wins against the land bank, called El Sabe the week the news became public. I should have looked closer at my own numbers, he admitted. I just assumed the bank knew what they were doing. Quiet vindication settled over El Sabe in the months that followed, though she rarely brought up the case unless someone asked directly. She kept farming the same 1,600 hectares her father had built from nothing, the land she'd very nearly lost to a miscalculation nobody at the bank had bothered to double-check. The folder of bank statements and loan documents that once sat scattered across her kitchen table now lives in a filing cabinet in her home office, no longer urgent, no longer a source of sleepless nights. El Sabe never raised her voice in that courtroom, not once. She'd simply known her numbers better than the institution that was supposed to know them for her. Sometimes, the quietest warning carries the most weight, especially when no one expects you to know more than they do. El Sabe never shouted. She just knew her numbers, and it saved everything her father built. If stories like this move you, subscribe, because there's more coming every week.